Gardermoen og skal ta flyet til Boston. Utenfor Boston ligger byen Cambridge, som har et av verdens beste universiteter. Vi skal møte Robert C Bordone, som er en av de store lærekreftene ved Harvards Program on Negotiation. Jeg planlegger å stille han spørsmål om hva som er hans beste forhandlingsteknikker, og hvordan du og jeg kommer bedre til å forhandle. Så jeg håper dette skal bli en spennende reise på alle mulige måter. Bli med meg, så skal vi se hva vi kan lære nå den nærmeste tiden.
So, maybe this is because I'm a negotiation professor, but I am somebody who sees negotiation pretty much everywhere. And I think that's very much the orientation that we take when we teach this topic. So sometimes people think, well, only a labor lawyer negotiates, or only somebody when they're getting a job over their salary is negotiating, or it's something that happens at the United Nations or in the foreign ministry. But I guess it's our view that every time you're trying to influence anyone's choice, you're in essence negotiating with them. And so that is something that we really do from when we're kids, trying to have our parents give us an extended bedtime, or maybe an ice cream, or to watch a favorite TV program.
Kids are great negotiators.
Kids are, they could be quite effective. I mean, maybe not on all the scores, because sometimes the way they get what they want is by wearing us down and making us crazy. But they're also pretty skillful in some ways that we would teach, right? So often, a kid, if he's told no, they'll say, but why?
Why is an important question.
And that is a really important question in negotiation. I think that one of the real challenges for most people is they have a pretty limited idea of what negotiation is.
So what is a negotiation in its essence? You're touching upon some of the points there.
Yeah, I mean, so the task of negotiation is really around influence and persuasion. I think that often people think negotiation is largely about dividing some fixed pie of goods, or a set amount of money, or a set amount of honors or accolades or roles. And I think one of our main points of emphasis is that is a pretty limited and really only half of the game when it comes to negotiation. Because a big part of negotiation is also how can you find some ways to what we call expand the size of the pie? So how can you find some ways where if you really look deeply at what both parties want, right, underneath what they say they want, their deeper needs and concerns, there's often ways that both sides can be made better off if they could find a way to actually work collaboratively with each other. And so for us, negotiation is really kind of two things. It's first, an activity of information exchange and creativity to expand the size of the negotiation pie. And then it's a task of effective problem solving to help divide that pie between the parties.
This is something you teach for a class that goes through several months, isn't it? So it's quite a complex field. Is it possible to try to boil it down a little bit to see if is there some I wouldn't say easy, but is it some isolated tactics or things that we can do which makes us a little bit better if we implement them?
Sure. I mean, it is, as you say, a very rich field that's very interdisciplinary and complex. So there are some basic things, right? So one, in terms of moves that are effective in negotiation, probably a skill set that is most important and that people tend to overlook is being a really good listener. And so asking good questions, and good questions meaning questions that are open-ended and curious, questions like why. That's one really big piece, as opposed to simply being assertive. Secondly, why is that? Well, I think part of it is that we often think that if we're persuading, we need to be talking, but it's actually the case that if we're doing a bunch of talking but don't know what would be persuasive to the other side, it's kind of wasted. And so asking really good questions, being curious about the other person, helps us actually learn what really matters to them. And I think for me that leads to kind of a second really important skill, which is a skill of perspective taking. In a negotiation, we're typically not trying to persuade ourselves. We're trying to persuade somebody else.
Of course.
And in order to persuade somebody else, we have to really understand what does the world look like from their perspective. Now, none of us can do that perfectly unless we can magically become them. But the more we can think about and put ourselves into their world, what would it look like, the more effective we'll be. So one of the questions I'll often ask if I'm doing consulting with a client who maybe is having a negotiation, challenge or opportunity, I'll say, okay, so you presented the other side with this choice. If you were the other side, would you say yes to this? Now, a lot of times...
That's so easy to do, but it's hard.
It's hard, and clients will resist. They'll well, I'm not the other side, or this is what they should do. I'm like, no, I understand, but just let's do a thought experiment. Let's imagine you are the CEO, and this is the choice you've been given. Would you say yes? And many times they'll say, no, of course I wouldn't say yes. I'll say, okay, so now we shouldn't be surprised if they say no. Right? You have to craft something that's yesable. So that would be the second piece, right? Listening, perspective taking.
Is that putting yourselves in the other person's shoes?
That's right. Putting yourself in the other person's shoes, which is a tedious task, and particularly, I think it's easier to do in a deal-making situation. Not easy, but easier. Harder to do in a conflict situation. Harder to do when you already don't like the other side or think they're in the wrong or have been hurt by them in some way. And then you're being asked to put yourself in their shoes, and that's the last thing you want to do because you're angry.
Of course.
And I think the two other things I would say just on this topic around negotiation, one is just not underestimating the role of emotions in negotiation. And lots of times people say, well, the best thing to do is not be emotional. I mean, that's nice advice, but not practical since we're human beings.
In the real world, you cannot know.
People have emotions, right? We're not negotiating with computers. And the second really critical skill, and I think this is a part of the work that I do when I do negotiation training or when I do individual coaching, which I do a fair amount of, is how can you increase someone's self-awareness, right? Their own understanding of their own strengths and their own weaknesses. Because there's a lot of research that suggests really skillful negotiators, what they're best at is not necessarily being assertive or being empathic or being creative. What they're best at is their self-description is very closely aligned to how others think of them. So people who are less good are people who think they're assertive, but no one else, they think of themselves as assertive, but nobody else thinks of them that way.
No, of course.
Or they think they're a good listener, but nobody else thinks of them that way. So self-awareness is a really important skill.
A little on that topic, you had an election here last year, and you have quite an assertive president now, Trump, and he claims that he is the world's best negotiator. But you are one of the absolute experts. You're a professor at Harvard. What would be your opinion on on his scorecard as a negotiator?
I mean, reasonable people can differ, but I would say that a lot of it depends on what do you mean by best. I think Donald Trump is a decently good transactional negotiator. That is, he knows how to use his leverage to get what he wants in the short term. But that is a pretty flimsy and short-sighted view of negotiation. And in fact, really skillful negotiators obviously want to get what they need or want.
At this point in time, yes.
But there's a broader set of things that matter: the stability and durability of the agreement, the ability to do repeat deals, the ability to have enough capital that you can work with other parties who are part of the wider system. And on all of these scores, Donald Trump has been a pretty bad negotiator. And in his own business, you see so many people who are not interested in repeat play, so many people who feel quite burned by him. And it's easy to say, well, you're a great negotiator if you were born with millions of dollars and you started out with a huge amount of leverage, right? I always think a really great negotiator is somebody who has almost no leverage and then finds ways to get things done, right? So I think most of my colleagues would also agree that Print has a pretty limited and cramped view of negotiation and what effective would be. And in some sense, we're starting to see that play out, at least in the United States. He's not succeeded on major pieces of legislation. By the time this podcast airs, there may or may not be healthcare reform.
Yeah, it's a big issue.
What we know is that if we do have it, it will have had very little to do with him. And for a new president with his party ruling both houses of Congress, you would imagine that president ought to have an enormous ability to influence this. And in fact, he doesn't. So we don't know how that's going to play out, and it'll be interesting to see, what happens in the next few years. But world's best negotiator is not a word I would use to describe him.
But if you leave Trump, because there's lots of Trumps out there, so if you take just the archetype that he represents, the hard bargaining person using all his leverage, how do people confront those in a negotiation? I mean, there's so much things that goes into a negotiation, of course, but I think many people are wondering about that.
Yeah, so this is a really hard challenge. What do you do when the other side is very difficult, and also when they haven't responded? I mean, one of the things that we talk about in our course, we have a long prescription, a long set of things that we suggest that you can do to try to really tame that hard negotiator. Some of them related to listening, some of them related to various ways to reframe the negotiation. And at times, there may be ways where you could strategically achieve your goal without dealing with that particular person. So for example, there may be ways to find somebody else who has some influence with that person, who you have influence with.
So you
go around, right? And there's a whole host of strategies like that. Sometimes you don't have that opportunity, right? And at the end of the day, sometimes you have to make a decision of, is reaching agreement with this person better than what I would do if I didn't have an agreement? And in those situations, you do the best you can, but what I always would coach somebody would be to say, okay, so you signed this deal for 2 years because in this moment it was really better than not signing. But what you really want to make sure of now is that in 2 years from now, you're not in that situation.
You use those.
Right, you're going to use that time to improve your alternative, to find other choices and other players. And so in the long run, right, that could really end up hurting that person who is quite hard bargaining because they'll lose the deal or lose the contract going forward.
I know that you've also been working a lot with Norwegians over the years. Of course, holding classes here at Harvard, but also holding classes in Norway.
Yes,
actually. Yeah.
yes, I miss going to Norway.
Maybe you could arrange something.
Maybe someone will hire me to come to Norway, but I love to come to Norway. It's such a beautiful country with and really nice people. So,
but have you done any thoughts on Norwegians as negotiators? For instance, versus Americans, because we might seem quite like, but I think there's some cultural differences there. Have you observed something?
I think there are some pretty remarkable differences, actually, and in ways that cut to the favor of Norwegians. So my experience, I mean, I have not done any empirical research on this, and while I've been teaching in Norway since 2003, it's still a relatively small set of people every year. But my sense is that, as a general stereotype, Norwegians are much more consistently level-headed, less likely to get very emotional at the negotiation table. I think not surprisingly, tend to care for and value fairness in negotiation, or at least outcomes that are more equal. I think that I experience Norwegians as in some ways being much more open to a mutual gains or principled approach that we teach. I think it's consistent with my sense is that kind of a national ethic. And I'm imagining that there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, mine might be just kind of culture, but also it is a smaller market of people, so reputations do matter more. I've always been struck through the years of, I just finished a program yesterday, and someone from that program knew someone who was on the program the year before. So kind of coming in and barreling forward and banging your hand on the table probably has much higher costs in a Norwegian context than it would in an American context, although there are reputations that matter in any market, including the United States, right? Because if you're working in a niche industry and people in that industry know each other. But it still may be, so that may be one reason. So I think there are some real differences, at least in those ways, around kind of, like I said, there's a certain kind of more rational level headedness that you might see a lot more variation in the American context.
Is there some fields that you think we are lacking that we could improve and should focus on?
That's a great question. I mean, I always think, and we could all improve everywhere.
Of course.
I mean, I think that one of the things that we'll talk about a little bit about in the advanced course is the role of emotions in negotiation. And I think my experience, again, this may be consistent with at least a stereotype, is that Norwegians are a little less likely to express their emotions directly, and to be as attentive. And I think that is something that we think is really important in negotiation. So the notion that what we should do is get rid of our emotions or keep it from getting emotional is kind of not the advice that we have. So that would be maybe one domain. And again, this goes to your idea of what a good outcome is, but there are definitely times when I think, you could actually aspire to claim a bigger piece of that pie if you wanted to. But overall, I would say kind of across the board, I think Norwegians are pretty good negotiators. So
that's a good starting point.
Yeah.
Then. There's probably lots of mistakes that we can do in negotiations, and probably so many that we can spend a whole evening just talking about them. But what's the most common mistakes that we do? Yeah,
I mean, there are probably a number of really common ones. One that I think is really critical is that we tend to over-attribute intentionality to the other side. So that is to say, if the other side does something that upsets us, damages us, hurts us, we tend to assume they meant to upset, damage, hurt. and that then causes us to retaliate.
And then it goes on.
And then you're in a conflict spiral. So I think anything in that moment to kind of help you hold back from making the attribution of intentionality would be really good, right? So how can I get curious? Which doesn't mean that you're not upset or hurt or damaged or in some way. It just means that I'm not going to say you intended to do that, because I think that's the piece that that can be really bad. Yeah.
Many of the people listening are executives and HR personnel, and they are in negotiations with their employees.
Yes.
Are there some special things to think about when you're negotiating in the workplace? That you can think of? Yeah.
Yeah. So really, really great question. I do a fair amount of actually negotiation training for HR departments, not surprisingly, because I think people in HR are always negotiating, right? Obviously, there's a piece around new employees and salaries, and so recruitment and retention. But then there's this whole other domain around management and professional development. And so part of the skill set, I think, is the basic negotiation information around moving from positions to interests, but then also this is people's careers, right? So there's a huge amount of emotion involved. There's also identity questions involved. There's also organizational culture involved, and systems, and how do you operate in systems, and what is the way in which systems impact individual behavior. And so I think that, for an HR executive trying to navigate those waters with, an individual employee, it's or a team, which sometimes they're doing interventions with a team, they have to be really aware of all of these dynamics. And so figuring out what are the identity issues that might be in play for this employee who might have been around for 15, 20, 25 years. I'm thinking about the intangibles that might matter, but there's obviously salary and benefits. There's also issues around reporting structure, autonomy, role, status, affiliation. So all of those really come into play in a particular way. And those are things that are actually particularly interesting to me. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I love working in training and teaching in that context.
Oh, perfect.
Sick.
So Bob, it's been a pleasure. I know you are very short on time.
No, it's kind of you to invite me.
But it's been great talking to you now, and I hope we'll have some great days here with the advanced course, and I hope we can talk in the future as well.
Thank you. I look forward to it, and I look forward to hopefully seeing some of you in Norway.
Perfect.
Okay. Bye-bye.